You're listening to the Thoughts for Living podcast, coming to you from the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, Montgomery, Alabama. You know, in the first episode, we were discussing some current events taking place here in the United States. Events like the tragic Buffalo Massacre and the massacre of children in Uvalde, Texas. And we had begun that discussion using an article that Cornel West had authored for the Guardian magazine online. And Brother West was admonishing us to remember that the murders of the African Americans during Bible study at the Emmanuel African American Episcopal Church in Charleston, and the murders of American Asians in Atlanta and Chicanos in El Paso, Texas in 2019, and also our Jewish brothers and sisters who worship at the Tree of Life Synagogue, to look at all of these incidents through a collective lens, as opposed to looking at these incidents in isolation. And one of the reasons that it was important to look at these mass murders, these racist murders and killing of people of color, was that to look at them in isolation really hides systemic and institutional oppression, which is really what is responsible for the context in which these ongoing massacres take place. Scholar John A. Powell, for example, had us to understand that racialization, which he defines as the practices, cultural norms, and institutional arrangements that both reflect and help to create and maintain race-based outcomes in societies, are really what's behind what we are experiencing. And if we look at this only as lone wolves, as bad cops, or mentally deranged people, we really miss what's driving racial hatred and animus in the United States. And the main thing that we can draw, I think we talked about in the last segment, is that this is not something that just started recently. These conditions are historic from the beginning that white settlers came to this continent. They have, especially those powerful whites, have played the most powerful role in constructing and maintaining white racist societies. When the first colonists came here, there were upwards of 10 million Native American people in this section that we would call, which would later be called the United States, alone. Probably about, some say up to 50 million across the entire continent. And so basically you have a situation where you have 10 million native peoples versus a boatload of Europeans. And so the question would be, how does a boatload of Europeans end up controlling the land of 50 million native peoples? Well, the only way to do that, you've got to kill some people. If you're going to take it from them. And we do not want to recognize that that has been the history of this nation, in this nation. We continually try to hide behind individual acts being perpetrated by individual persons. No. A lone individual cannot take a continent. And we have to really be willing to admit the truth. And I must say, from using ecological consciousness theory, it seems that many of our European American brothers and sisters are simply afraid to remember, afraid to recognize the real history that concerns their direct ancestors and what they actually had to do in order to take this land from the indigenous people who already lived here. Now that would have been enough, you would think. But to then go from taking this land from the indigenous people who lived here to sailing ships to the continent of Africa and kidnapping Africans and bringing them here to this nation, trafficking them here, and if they were fortunate enough to survive, then to sell Africans as though they were animals. Now, if you look at that history, a rational person would say, why do you feel afraid? No one came to your country, no people of color came to your country and oppressed you, came to your country and took your land, came to your country and tried to change your religion and tried to change your language. But this is all on the record for European colonization, not only in the United States, but across the planet. And to now say, after 400 years of this ongoing behavior, time after time after time, that today in 2022, descendants of European colonizers who now control this nation are afraid of replacement? I'm sorry, but that doesn't pass the giggle test. If we use ecological consciousness theory, I think it will help us to clarify some of what we are experiencing. Ecological consciousness theory suggests that the first people on the planet, our African ancestors, okay? There are no other people on the earth at this time. African people are the first human beings on planet Earth. The first people we recognize as Homo sapiens sapien, as they say in the research. And we suggest in ecological consciousness theory that that first group of people recognized very early on that there was safety in numbers, and so the group became an important entity. The group became the means through which they would satisfy their physical and emotional needs. They needed food, they needed clothing, they needed shelter, they needed fresh water, they needed fresh air. And as a group, in order to obtain these needs, these necessities, our ancestors, our African ancestors, learned not only to value each other, but to value working together. Collaboration. Out of collaboration came various roles that members of the group undertook in order to meet their basic needs, their basic survival needs: food, clothing, shelter. Today, that would include transportation and access to the internet. Not only did they value the group and collaboration, but over time, the first humans came to value spirituality. They came to an understanding of spirituality. That after being hunter-gatherers and having to live somewhat nomadic existence, following herds, following the seasons where fruit and vegetables grew. Over time, over thousands and thousands of years, they come to develop agriculture. Over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, they come to develop animal husbandry. They learn to domesticate animals. They learn to plant crops. Now, this was a big step for humanity because now they can stay in one place if they chose to do so. We know that many or some left Africa about 150,000 years ago. And at that time, there are no other people on the earth but Africans. In other words, my friends, can you believe that there was a time on the earth where there was no one who resembled what today would be called a European? There were no white people. All right? They did not exist in reality. They existed in the bodies of Africans because later on, as our ancestors moved to different places around the earth through filiation, over time, those that were dark because of the climate conditions they were in, who needed to absorb sunlight over time. Dark skin gave way to lighter skin. Kinky hair gave way to straight hair. And then you have these changes that take place over time. And then you have what we might now call a European or a white. But that European and a white comes from an African. So there's no such thing as pure white people. There's never been pure white because the first people on the planet weren't white. The first people on the planet were Africans. And so those who remained, those who left, took culture with them. Those who remain on the continent continue to evolve their culture, growing crops, domesticating animals, and they come to realize that in that process, they see life as a interrelated, symbiotic network, that they are dependent upon plant life and animal life. They're dependent upon fresh water and fresh air. They're dependent upon life on land and life in the water. They do not see themselves as living outside of the ecology, outside of life. They see themselves as a part of this living process, this living interconnectedness. And in that, they see in their own bodies they can reproduce. They see when they plant seeds in the ground, those seeds come back up and reproduce. They see with their herds that they reproduce. I don't think it's much for them to understand that they are creators, that they can recreate, and then to extrapolate from that they themselves are created beings. And out of living this way, in conjunction, seeing the cycle of life, right? Of life, then death, and then rebirth, they come to understand that they are created beings. And so much so, they come to understand that there is a creator. And they also come to understand that there is life after death. That death is not a finality, but a transition. So much so that we find with our Egyptian ancestors that they buried, that when buried, they would bury the objects that they thought that they would need in the afterlife with them. Now, that's probably to most a very elementary understanding, but we can see that through that behavior, they had an understanding, of life after death. And then that life after death, they also understood it in a bifurcated way. They understood, not in these terms, but they understood a heaven and a hell, an underworld. And so these values are established by the first people who lived on the planet. They value the group, they value collaboration, they come to value spirituality, and ecological consciousness theory suggests that out of living that way, they come to value personhood. The object of living in this way is to develop a good person. And what is a good person? A good person is one whose behavior and whose speech and actions enhances the group. And a bad person would be the contrary. One whose behavior and actions would put the group at risk would be a bad person. You know, I've said this before and time again. My mother really didn't care what vocation I chose. She wanted me to be a good person. She wanted me to reproduce the values that she had taught me in that home and the values that the community in which I lived reinforced. And ecological consciousness theory suggests that these values, these default values that come from the first human beings on the planet are our default within us all. This value system is innate. We value the group, collaboration, spirituality, and personhood. Now, sometime around the 17th century Enlightenment period, when white males rebel against feudalism and rebel against the authority of the church, rather than seeing the world from a we focus, the European male sees the world from an I focus. So rather than the group being important, the European male makes the individual the most important. Contrary to the group, he makes the individual. And rather than collaboration, ecological consciousness theory suggests that the European makes competition the rationale behind human relations. And so it's not what's best for the group, it becomes what's best for the individual. And it's not working together, now it's competing. And we get this pseudoscience from Darwinism, you know, dog eat dog world, the survival of the fittest. And European males use this pseudoscience as justification for then establishing that whiteness and maleness are the primary characteristics of humanity. I mean, it would be likened unto sitting in a football stadium of nothing but people of color, and you got one row of Europeans and that's white, and they stand up and say, because it's just one row of us, we ought to be the most important people. Really? So not only do they establish individualism, they establish competition. Well, and that competition really is around what? Money, right? Right? So there's no morals involved in this. Because if I'm competing for food, then they would suggest anything you do, Machiavellian, anything I got to do to stay alive, if I have to kill you to do it, then so be it. There's no ethics in that, right? They say kill the competition, right? In business, right? You compete. And that's why we have competition throughout this society. Game shows, TV shows, sports, business, students in school competing, everything is just competition, 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 competition. And then somebody has the nerve to stand up and say, well, we need to work together. How? Your whole focus is competing and competing to beat the competition. Those whom you deem competition. So there's no morality, no ethics. And out of living that way, of viewing the world in that manner, as an individual, as competitive, as secular, then the outcome, according to ecological consciousness theory, is personal achievement. So that you are to be respected regardless of what you do to achieve status. You're supposed to be respected. Whether you steal, lie, or kill, if you gain status, then you're supposed to be respected. And ecological consciousness theory suggests that these value systems are in contestation. And we suggest that there's only one value system that's sustainable. The only value system that's sustainable, that would allow human beings to remain viable on this planet, is if we continue to remember who we are and value the group, value collaboration, value spirituality, and value personhood. But if we remain in this Western madness of individualism, competition, secularism, and personal achievement, it will end in the demise of human beings. Because that is the attitude that leads to how we treat the earth. Individualism, that mindset, is represented in corporate activities which destroy land and destroy water, not caring about the people who might have to drink that water or people who need to live on the land. Oh, it's tough. It's my individual right. It's my individual right to make money. If I spew something into the air and you can't breathe, your child has asthma, tough. You need to move because it's my right to make money. And we don't want any regulations, nothing to interfere with my making money because it's my right. That value system is not sustainable. And we would suggest in the context of world affairs, it is that value system that would lead you to go into a country and kill the people there and take their land. That type of value system would allow you to go and kidnap people and sell human beings for money and rape the women and then sell the children that you father from those women because it's your individual right. It's about competition. It's about making money. It doesn't have anything to do with ethics or morals. You just want personal achievement, to be called Mr. Big Shot, to have the most money, the most cars, the biggest house. And whatever you do to get it, you don't mind what you have to do to get it. And this is what we have seen done across the earth for 400 years. White imperialism. And you have the nerve to say that you are afraid of replacement. In summation, if you want fear to stop, if you really want to stop being afraid, European American whites need to stop thinking white and start thinking right. You need to stop thinking white and start thinking right. Now, what do I mean by that? The overemphasis that oppressors place on individualism focuses whites to be concerned with their phenotypic group and its values, which gives a false sense of separation from the rest of the world that's populated by people of color. And by thinking right, I mean this: to focus on the human family, the reality that humans are social beings dependent upon each other and all living things. It means to minimize individualism, competition, secularism, and personal achievement, and maximize the importance of the group, womankind, collaboration, spirituality, and personhood. This is the value system that is sustainable. and seeks to conserve the meaningfulness of living relations while providing a basis for addressing our mutual needs in ways that support the effective development of humanity and the biosphere that we need to live. Lastly, if humanity survives, we all survive. But it appears that many supremacists are only concerned with white survival. My friends, the world is populated by people of color, and it is inevitable that those demographics will continue to grow. All of humanity comes from our common African ancestors. Stop thinking white and start thinking right. Humanity, the survival of our species, is important. And it won't be found in simply being concerned about the survival of white people themselves. You've been listening to the Thoughts for Living podcast.